In the damp shadows of the streets of New York, Steve slips stealthily, his heart pounding in his chest like an out-of-tune drum. His light feet stomp in the puddles of dirty water as he hurries away, the police siren growing in intensity behind him. He turns sharply in a narrow alley, his lungs burning from the effort, adrenaline coursing through his veins like fire. The sounds of voices and heavy footsteps echo off the brick walls around him, causing him to speed up even more. Steve knows he needs to hide, disappear into the vastness of the city before the cops surround him. With a nimble movement, he jumps over a fence, falling into an abandoned yard. The air is impregnated with the pungent smell of garbage and dampness, but Steve does not have time to care. He runs into a dilapidated old apartment building, its windows broken and graffiti covering the walls. Inside the building, darkness is almost total, and Steve moves carefully, knowing every step, every corner. He finds a hiding place behind a pile of old boxes and crouches down, trying to control his wheezing. The footsteps of the policemen approach, and he hears their voices exchanging quick orders. He must be around. An authoritative voice echoes down the hall. Steve closes his eyes, trying to make himself invisible, his body shaking with fear and excitement. For a moment, time seems to stand still, and he hears only the sound of his own heart. Then, as if by a miracle, the footsteps begin to move away, the siren decreasing in intensity until it disappears completely. Steve exhales a sigh of relief, his muscles relaxing a bit. He knows he's not safe yet, but at least he managed to escape this time. Coming out of hiding, he begins to think about his next step. He needs to find a place to hide and rest, away from the bright lights and watchful eyes of the city. Without realizing it, he is being watched. From a dark corner of the building, a pair of watchful eyes follows your every move. A man with deep scars and a quiet strength observes Steve with peculiar interest. He sees more than a lost and frightened boy. He sees a soul in search of redemption. After narrowly escaping the police, Steve continues on his way, his eyes attentive to every shadow and every movement on the dark streets of New York. He follows through alleys and alleys until he finds a place he considers safe, an old abandoned warehouse that he uses as an occasional refuge. Upon entering, he lets out a sigh of relief and throws himself into a corner covered in cardboard and old fabrics, his exhausted body still shaking with adrenaline. With trembling hands, he pulls from his pocket the bag he stole, a small and worn one. Dumping its contents on the dirty floor in front of him, he frowns in disappointment. Coins, a few crumpled notes, a cheap lipstick, and a pair of keys. That's it? He mutters angrily, kicking an empty aluminum can that echoes in the silence of the warehouse. That old woman had nothing of value. Suddenly, a deep, steady voice interrupts his thoughts. You should keep it and give it back to whoever took it. Steve startles, his heart almost stopping. He looks up to find a man standing in front of him, a stranger with an imposing presence. The dim light that enters through the broken windows reveals a scarred face and eyes that emanate a hard, unchallenged wisdom. Who are you? Steve asks, his voice shaking a little, as his eyes search for a way out. Someone who has been where you are now, the man replies, without looking away. I have done things that I am not proud of, but I have learned that the path you are following leads to nothing but destruction. Steve tries to laugh, but a dry, nervous sound comes out. And what do you know about me? Challenge him. You don't know anything about my life. The man steps forward, his presence becoming even more oppressive. I know more than you know. I know that no matter how hard you try to convince yourself that you are in control, the truth is that you are lost. And stealing from an old lady only proves it. Steve looks away, his mind racing. He feels a growing weight of guilt that he tried so hard to ignore. Why do you care? He asks, more softly, almost in a whisper. The man sighs, his gaze softening a little. Because I was once you, Steve. And I know that if you continue like this, you will end up destroying yourself and others. You have a choice now. You can continue on this path, or try something different. Steve feels a lump form in his throat. The man's words resonate in his mind, challenging his worldview. For the first time in a long time, he feels a spark of doubt, a small voice inside him that asks if maybe, just maybe, there is another way. How do you know my name? He asks, finally, the voice faltering. The man just smiles, a sad smile and full of understanding. It doesn't matter now. What matters is what you're going to do next. Steve looks at the small amount of stolen goods scattered in front of him. Suddenly they seem incredibly insignificant. He swallows it in his tracks, feeling a decision form inside him, one he never thought he would make. As Steve stares at the man in front of him, an avalanche of memories invades his mind. Painful and fragmented memories, which he normally tries to avoid, now seem impossible to ignore. Steve was born anonymously in a public hospital, immediately handed over to the adoption system. The orphanage that took him in was a bleak place, where care was scarce and mistreatment abundant. He remembers the cold nights, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the sweat of children huddled in hard beds. Caregivers rarely showed any form of affection, treating orphans more as a burden than as human beings. Steve learned early on that life there was a constant battle. Any sign of weakness was an opportunity to be exploited. He became a tough and resilient child, his emotions buried deep to survive the hostile environment. At the age of 7, the limit of his endurance was reached. On a night when the full moon dimly illuminated the dormitory, he found an unlocked window. With a racing heart and not looking back, Steve fled the orphanage, leaving behind a place that brought him only pain and suffering. Life on the streets of New York was not easier, but at least he had the freedom to choose his own steps. He learned to survive by begging, stealing, and taking advantage of the opportunities that arose. Each day was a struggle for survival, and Steve became a master of blending into the shadows, of finding refuge in the most unlikely places. Trust in any person disappeared over time. The city was a battlefield, and he was a lone soldier. He learned to distrust everyone, to depend on no one but himself. The skills of pickpocketing and sneaking through alleys became his way of life, a skill he honed over time. Now, looking at the man in front of him, Steve realizes that these same skills are what brought him here. The weight of the past is still present in every choice you make, in every path you decide to follow. The stranger, with his look of understanding and steadfastness, represents something Steve has never known: the possibility of redemption. You don't have to go on like this, Steve. The man's voice interrupts his thoughts, bringing him back to the present. There's a way to change, but only you can decide if you're ready for this. Steve lowers his head, his thoughts a whirlwind. The frightened child he was is still there, buried under layers of mistrust and fear. But maybe, just maybe, there is a chance to free her. Terrified by the unexpected confrontation, Steve feels a surge of adrenaline and fear run through his body. Without thinking twice, he gets up and runs, his feet moving quickly while his heart beats like a drum. He does not look back, does not want to see if the man is following him. All that matters is to escape, to find a new hiding place. The alleys of New York are familiar mazes to Steve, and he navigates them with the skill of a sewer rat, knowing every turn, every obstacle. He runs along narrow streets, jumps over garbage cans, and turns corners at high speed. Each step is a desperate attempt to leave the bewildering encounter behind. Reaching a high wall, he does not hesitate. With an agile movement, he scales the structure, his fingers finding support in the cracks and protrusions. In a final effort, he pulls himself to the top and jumps to the other side, landing in a small backyard that leads to an abandoned house. The house is in ruins, its windows broken and the paint peeling off. Steve knows the place well. It's one of his favorite hideaways. He sneaks through the back door, climbing the creaking stairs to the roof. Upstairs, he hides behind a broken chimney, trying to control his wheezing. Sitting high on the roof, Steve feels a growing anger boil inside him. Anger at the man who confronted him. Anger at his own weakness at being caught off guard. Anger at a world that seems determined to bring him down at every turn. He punches the roof hard, the impact echoing in the silence of the night. Who does he think he is? Steve mutters through gritted teeth, his voice heavy with frustration. He doesn't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through. The stranger's words, however, continue to echo in his mind. You have a choice now. The idea that he can change his destiny, that he can find a way to escape the cycle of violence and suffering, is both tempting and frightening. He spent so long surviving, fighting a world that seemed intent on destroying him, that the idea of redemption seems almost impossible. But deep in his anger, there is a small spark of hope. Steve looks at the horizon, the vastness of the city illuminated by night lights. Maybe, somewhere inside, he knows the man was right. But admitting it is a battle he is not yet ready to face. For now, all he can do is hide, let his anger consume him, and try to find a way forward. The future is uncertain, but Steve knows that the choice in the end will be his alone. The first light of the morning penetrates through the heavy clouds of New York, illuminating the alleys and streets with a gray pallor. Steve rises from the roof where he spent the night, his muscles aching and his mind still a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. He carefully descends from the abandoned house and blends into the steady stream of people starting their day in the city. The alleys are his home, and he knows them like the back of his hand. Walking aimlessly, he encounters some familiar faces: other homeless people, petty thieves, and beggars who, like him, struggle to survive in the urban jungle. They exchange quick greetings, the quiet camaraderie of those who share the same struggle. Steve approaches a corner where a group of men are gathered around a barrel, warming their hands on the makeshift fire. One of the men, an old man named Frank, waves to him. "Hey Steve," calls Frank, with a toothless smile. "Come here, we got some food." Steve joins the group, feeling the comforting warmth of the fire. They share what they have: pieces of bread, some fruit, and a little coffee drain. It's a simple meal, but for Steve, it's enough. As he chews on the dried bread, he observes the people around him, feeling a familiarity that is both comforting and heartbreaking. "Sounds like you had a rough night, kid," Frank comments, his experienced eyes noticing the tiredness on Steve's face. Steve shrugs, not wanting to go into detail. "Nothing I can't handle, Frank." After the meal, Steve gets up and decides to continue his walk. He feels a growing restlessness, a sense of boredom that he cannot shake off. The same streets, the same faces, the same daily challenges. It all seems repetitive and meaningless. While walking, he passes a park where children play under the watchful supervision of their parents. He watches from afar, a twinge of envy and sadness shooting through his chest. He never had such a childhood, never knew the love and security that these children seem to have in abundance. Steve wonders what could be different. The mystery man's words from the night before continue to echo in his mind, a nagging memory he can't shake. You have a choice now, but what would that choice be? And would he really be ready to do something different? Feeling lost in his thoughts, Steve stops in a secluded alley and sits in an old box, watching the movement of the city around him. New York never stops, never sleeps. But for Steve, it feels like he's stuck in an endless cycle, a wheel that spins endlessly. He closes his eyes, trying to find a moment of peace amid the chaos. Maybe today is just another day like so many others. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the beginning of something different, something he cannot yet fully comprehend, but which begins to form as a possibility in his restless mind. Night falls over New York with a blanket of darkness dotted by the city lights. For Steve, darkness is an old companion, offering him cover for his wrongdoing. He moves through the shadows skillfully, his eyes trained to detect the slightest opportunities. Tonight, he decides to take another chance. He locates a target, a distracted passerby with an expensive mobile phone. Steve approaches silently, his hands quick as lightning as he pulls the device out of the man's pocket. But this time, your luck is not on your side. A nearby police patrol notices the movement and starts chasing him. Steve runs, his heart beating frantically as the screams of the cops echo behind him. He knows the streets well, but the fear of being caught is palpable. He turns corners, jumps over garbage cans, and sneaks through narrow alleys. But the cops do not give up. With his lungs burning and his mind panicking, Steve finds himself trapped in a dead end. The tall, dirty walls seem to close in around him, and he knows he's trapped. The sound of approaching footsteps and the lights of lanterns flickering in the shadows intensify his despair. It can't be like this, not now, he mutters to himself, trying to find a way out. Suddenly, a figure emerges from the shadows as if materializing out of nowhere. It's the man from the night before, the scarred stranger with piercing eyes. Without a word, the man pulls Steve into a trapdoor hidden behind a pile of boxes. They quickly enter, and the man quietly closes the lid, muffling the sounds of the outside world. The policemen rush past, their voices increasingly distant. Steve, panting and scared, tries to control his breathing as he looks at the man next to him. "You again?" Steve asks, his voice trembling. The man nods, his eyes fixed on Steve with an intensity that mixes understanding and determination. "I told you that you had a choice," he calmly answers. "And it looks like he hasn't made the right decision yet." Steve looks away, feeling the anger and frustration grow again. "I didn't ask for your help. I don't need anyone." The man sighs, his expression softening slightly. "Maybe you don't have to, but everyone deserves a second chance. Even you, Steve." The man's words pierce the shell of hardness that Steve has built up over the years. He feels a mixture of emotions: fear, anger, and something he can't identify, something that seems almost like hope. "Why are you doing this?" Steve asks, his voice softer this time. "Why do you care about me?" The man looks at him for a long moment before answering. "Because I see in you the reflection of who I was. Someone who is lost, but who still has a chance to find a different path." Steve feels his defenses begin to sag, the wall of indifference and distrust slowly unraveling. They are silent for a while, hiding in the trapdoor, while the night continues outside. The silence in the trapdoor is dense, broken only by the sound of Steve's heavy breathing as he tries to calm down. The presence of the man beside him is both comforting and unsettling, a mix Steve can't quite decipher. Unable to contain his curiosity and need for answers, Steve turns to the man. "Who are you?" he asks, his voice heavy with urgency and confusion. "Why are you doing this for me?" The man looks at him with a calm expression, but his eyes reveal a depth of emotions and experiences that Steve cannot fully comprehend. He shakes his head slowly. "It doesn't matter now, Steve," he replies firmly, but not harshly. "What matters is that you are at an inflection point. You can keep running, living in the shadows, or you can decide to try something different. But that's your decision." Steve feels a mixture of frustration and curiosity. "You talk like you know me, but I don't know anything about you." The man smiles slightly, a smile that does not reach the eyes. "Maybe one day you will know more, but for now, all I ask is that you accompany me. Let me show you that there is another way." Distrust still struggles within Steve, but there's something in the man's voice, a sincerity he can't ignore. He feels this could be his chance, an opportunity he's never had before. Slowly, he nods. "All right," he says, hesitantly. "I'll go with you." The man stands up, reaching out to help Steve up. Steve accepts the hand, feeling the strength and firmness of the grip. Together they emerge from the trapdoor, the night still dark around them, but with a new sense of purpose hovering in the air. They walk the streets of New York, the man leading the way with sure steps. Steve follows him, his thoughts a whirlwind of questions and uncertainty. They walk in silence, the city alive around them with its usual chaos, but this time, Steve feels like he's about to discover something new, something that could change his life. Finally, they arrive at an old building with a worn but still sturdy facade. The man opens the door and signals for Steve to enter. "This is a safe place," he says, his voice soft but firm. "Here, you can start finding a new path." Steve looks at the man, still doubtful, but with a spark of hope. He walks through the door, feeling like he's leaving a part of his former self behind. The future is still uncertain, but for the first time, he feels he has a real choice about what comes next. The mysterious man looks at Steve with a serious and determined expression. "I want you to stay here until tomorrow morning, Steve," he says, his tone making it clear that he is not open to discussion. Steve frowns, frustration mixed with curiosity in his mind. "Why? What will happen tomorrow?" The man shakes his head, a slight smile touching his lips. "Just trust me. Wait here. Tomorrow, everything will make sense." Without further explanation, the man turns and leaves, leaving Steve alone in the old building. Steve watches the figure disappear into the darkness, feeling a mixture of confusion and apprehension. The night seems to drag on endlessly. Steve tries to settle on the hard floor, but his body is restless, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He thinks about the meeting with the man, the enigmatic words, and the feeling that something big is about to happen. But what? And why? Questions echo unanswered. Steve strolls through the small space, trying to occupy his mind. He observes every detail of the place, the worn walls, the old furniture, and the broken window that lets in a beam of light from the moon. He wonders who the man is, why he seems so determined to help him, and what he can expect the next morning. As the hours pass, Steve finds himself plagued by memories of his past. The cold nights at the orphanage, the harsh reality of the streets, the choices that led him here. He wonders if it is really possible to change, if he can escape the cycle of violence and hopelessness he has always known. As the night progresses, fatigue begins to weigh on your shoulders, but sleep does not come easily. He hears the sounds of the city outside, cars passing by, people talking, the distant murmur of a metropolis that never sleeps. Each noise seems to amplify his anxiety, the weight becoming almost unbearable. Finally, the first rays of the sun begin to illuminate the sky. Steve feels a mixture of relief and tension as the darkness gives way to the light. He stands up, his muscles aching and his mind still confused. He looks at the door, waiting for the return of the mysterious man. When morning finally comes, Steve is on the edge of his limit. He wants answers. He wants to understand what it all means. And most of all, want to know if this is really the chance to change your life. The door creaks open, and the man enters, his eyes meeting Steve's with an expression of calm determination. "You waited," he says, a slight smile forming on his lips. Steve, exhausted and anxious, just settles down. "Yeah, I waited. Now, tell me, what is it all about?" The man approaches and puts a firm hand on Steve's shoulder. "Now come on, I have something to show you." With these words, they leave together, Steve feeling that the real test is just beginning. Steve follows the man through the deserted streets, the first rays of sunshine tinting the horizon a soft orange. They walk in silence, the man with sure steps and Steve with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Finally, they reach an entrance to the sewer, an iron grate that the man opens with a loud creak. "Come on, it's this way," says the man, descending the narrow staircase that leads underground. Steve hesitates for a moment, looking around to make sure he's not being observed, before following the man into the sewer. The fetid smell hits him immediately, and he covers his nose and mouth with his hand. "This here stinks," Steve complains, trying not to take too deep a breath. "And you're crazy if you think I'm gonna stay in that hole." The man only smiles slightly as they continue to descend. "I may be crazy, but I'm doing the right thing. Unlike you, who is on a path that only leads to death or imprisonment." They arrive at an underground platform, a surprisingly large and well-lit space filled with makeshift equipment, maps, and supplies. This is what the man calls his headquarters. "Welcome to my home," he says, gesturing broadly. "This place gave me the freedom to plan and act without being seen. And now, it could be your chance to change your life." Steve looks around in disbelief. "That's crazy. Do you really think you will change anything from here?" The man turns to Steve, his piercing eyes fixing on his. "I do more from here than you ever did on the streets, Steve. And it's because I'm not mentally weak. I don't let society crush me like a cockroach. But you..." He shakes his head, disappointed. "You're letting it happen. I was wrong about you. Maybe you'd better go." The words cut deep, a mixture of hard truth and defiance that Steve wasn't expecting. Anger and frustration bubble up inside him, but he knows the man is right. He has been weak, letting himself be carried away by despair and hopelessness. "What if I want to stay?" Steve asks, his voice firmer than he expected. "What if I want to prove you wrong about me?" The man watches Steve for a long moment before answering. "If you really want to change, it will take more than words. It will require action, sacrifice, and, above all, determination. I can show you the way, but the journey is yours." Steve feels the seriousness in the man's words. He knows this may be his last chance to change, to find purpose and escape the cycle of destruction he has lived in for so long. "Then show me," Steve says, determination in his voice. "Show me how to change." The man nods, a smile of approval rising to his lips. "All right, Steve. Let's get started." Steve watches his mentor with curiosity and a hint of expectation as he invites him to sit in a corner of his headquarters. The surrounding environment seems less hostile now, more familiar after days of hard training and deep reflection. He settles in, ready to hear what the man has to say. The mentor stands in front of Steve, his tired eyes reflecting decades of struggle and perseverance. He takes a deep breath, as if searching for the right words to start with. "My name is Daniel," he begins, his voice firm and charged with experience. "Many years ago, I was a fighter, not in the glamorous rings, but in the dark streets of this city in some underground fights. I lived a life of challenges and dangers, always looking for a way to survive." Steve listens intently, captured by the life story of Daniel, a man whose towering presence hides a vulnerability he now shares. He continues, unraveling the events that led him to build his refuge in the city's underworld. "I have seen many young people like you, lost, without hope, trapped in a cycle of violence and despair. It was then that I decided I needed to do more than just survive. I wanted to make a difference, even if it was in the shadows. This place has become mine. It is where I plan and execute operations to help those who are on the margins of society, those who need an outstretched hand." Steve processes Daniel's words, a new understanding forming in his mind. He begins to see not just the man in front of him, but the mission he has embraced with such determination. A mission of personal redemption and social impact. "So you're like a night watchman? Some kind of superhero?" Steve asks with a laugh, his eyes meeting Daniel's for confirmation. Daniel looks at him very seriously. "That's not a joke, kid. I chose to operate in the shadows because that's where I can make the most difference. But more than that, I see potential in you, Steve. I see someone who can not only change their own life, but also help change the lives of others around them." Steve absorbs his mentor's words, a familiar warmth spreading in his chest. He thinks about everything he has learned in recent days, about the internal battles he has faced, and the steps he has taken towards a different future. "I want to do this, Daniel. I want to change. I really can change," says Steve, his voice firm with renewed determination. Daniel nods, satisfied with his pupil's answer. "Then let's continue. There is so much more to learn and so much more to do. We're just getting started." And so, Steve and Daniel embark together on a journey of transformation and hope, as the morning sun illuminates the underworld where their lives have intertwined. In the heart of New York, where stories intersect in the shadows, a new story is being written. The story of a boy who found his way through the darkness, guided by a mentor who saw in him the potential to be more than he ever imagined. Steve's training with Daniel reaches a new level of intensity. Each day begins before dawn, when the city is still shrouded in silence and shadows. The underground headquarters, once a haven of safety, now transforms into a personal battleground where Steve must face his own physical and mental limits. Steve wakes to the sound of an insistent alarm. He gets up with sore muscles, each movement a reminder of the challenges of the previous day. Daniel is already on his feet, waiting for him with a serious expression. "Come on, Steve. Training doesn't wait," he says, his tone firm but encouraging. Mornings begin with runs through the maze of underground tunnels. The air is heavy and humid, and each step seems more difficult than the previous one. Daniel maintains a relentless pace, always a few steps ahead, his breathing controlled and steady. After the races, it's time for strength training. Push-ups, sit-ups, lifting improvised weights. Each exercise is a battle against exhaustion. Steve feels his muscles burn, his breathing become heavy, but he refuses to give up. Afternoons are devoted to hand-to-hand combat. Daniel teaches Steve defense and attack techniques, precise movements that require not only strength, but also agility and strategy. Every blow, every block, is a lesson in self-confidence and control. "Focus, Steve. Use your mind as much as your body," instructs Daniel as they practice a detour movement. Brute force is nothing without the right strategy. Nights are set aside for recovery, but even that is a challenge. Daniel teaches Steve stretching and meditation techniques, ways to accelerate the healing of the body and mind. The pain is constant, a reminder of how far he needs to go, but also how far he has already come. "The pain is temporary, Steve," Daniel says as he applies a cold compress to the boy's aching muscles. "What you are building here is lasting." Every day becomes a struggle against one's limits. There are times when Steve feels like he can't go on, when the body trembles with exhaustion and the mind cries out for rest. But it's in those moments that Daniel is there, not to make things easier, but to remind Steve of why he's doing it. "You have to want that, Steve." More than anything, says Daniel during a particularly difficult session. "If you give up now, you are giving up on yourself." Over time, small victories begin to emerge. Steve realizes that he can run a little faster, that his blows are more accurate, that his endurance is increasing. Every little achievement is an impulse, a reminder that he is on the right track. But perhaps the biggest change occurs within Steve. He begins to realize that true strength is not only in his muscles, but in his ability to overcome pain, to face challenges with unwavering determination. He is learning to be resilient, to trust himself, and to believe that he is capable of more than he ever imagined. And so, day after day, Steve's training continues. Each session is a proof of your commitment, an opportunity to grow and strengthen. And although the road is arduous and the journey strenuous, he begins to see a future where he is no longer a lost boy on the streets, but a young man who has found his strength and his purpose. During training with Daniel, meditation and yoga sessions become an essential part of Steve's routine. In the underground headquarters, silence and calm contrast with the frenzy of physical exercises. These moments of introspection are in many ways more challenging than any race or combat. In one of these sessions, Daniel watches Steve intently as the boy tries to focus on his breathing. Steve sits cross-legged, his eyes closed, but his body still carries the tension of infighting. "You're trying too hard, Steve," Daniel says in a soft but firm voice. Meditation is not about controlling your thoughts or feelings, but rather about allowing them to come and go without clinging. Steve opens his eyes, meeting Daniel's piercing gaze. There is frustration on his face, a reflection of all the internal battles he still fights. "I try, but it's hard," Steve admits. "Sometimes I feel so angry. I can't let her go." Daniel approaches, sitting next to Steve. He puts a comforting hand on the boy's shoulder. "Anger is a powerful feeling, Steve. It is a natural response to the injustices and pain you have suffered. But if you cling to it, if you let it dominate you, it can become your complete ruin." Steve listens intently, absorbing every word. He knows that Daniel speaks from experience, that his words are the fruit of years of struggle and self-knowledge. "But how do I let her go?" Steve asks, his voice charged with sincerity. Daniel takes a deep breath before answering. "You need to learn to observe your feelings without identifying with them. See anger as a cloud passing through the sky. She's there, but it's not you. You are the vast and unchanging sky, and feelings are only passing phenomena. When you feel anger rising, take a deep breath and observe it. Just acknowledge her and let her go." They return to meditation, and Steve tries to follow Daniel's advice. He feels anger bubbling inside him, but instead of fighting it, he watches it. He realizes the source of his anger, the painful memories, the injustices suffered, the fear of abandonment. And little by little, he begins to understand that these feelings, although intense, do not define him. Over the weeks, this practice becomes a turning point for Steve. He still feels the anger, but is now able to deal with it in a way that doesn't consume him. He learns to find a balance, to recognize his feelings without letting himself be controlled by them. Daniel, seeing Steve's progress, feels a sense of pride and hope. He knows that the road is still long and full of challenges, but he sees in Steve the ability to overcome his inner battles and build a different life. As the days go by, Steve and Daniel intensify their combat training. In the underground headquarters, the space is transformed into a makeshift dojo. Worn tatami mats cover the floor, and punching bags are hung from steel beams. The atmosphere is tense, charged with the promise of new skills and challenges. Steve gets up before dawn, feeling the familiar pain of fatigued muscles, but also a growing determination. Daniel is already prepared, dressed in light and comfortable clothes, ready for the day's workout. They begin with boxing, Steve's fists pounding against the punching bags under Daniel's watchful supervision. "Remember, Steve," Strength comes from technique, not anger, Daniel instructs as Steve delivers a series of quick blows. Control your breathing, focus on accuracy. Boxing sessions soon alternate with Muay Thai. Steve learns to use elbows and knees, the power of the blows increasing with each workout. He feels the adrenaline and sometimes anger seething within him, propelling his movements. In one of these sessions, he delivers a blow more forcefully than necessary, his face contorted into an expression of fury. "Stop," Daniel shouts, interrupting the workout. "Do not use anger as fuel. It blinds you, makes you make mistakes. Fight with your head, not your heart." Steve stops panting, feeling Daniel's reprimand as an unexpected blow. He lowers his eyes, aware that anger is still an internal enemy that he needs to master. Training continues with wrestling and jiu-jitsu. Steve learns the importance of control and technique, of how each move can destabilize an opponent without the need for brute force. Daniel patiently demonstrates each technique, while Steve practices, repeating the movements until they become instinctive. In wrestling, you need to use the weight of the opponent against him, explains Daniel, immobilizing Steve with an agile movement. It's about leverage and timing. In jiu-jitsu, patience is crucial. Wait for the right opening. Over time, Steve begins to integrate Kung Fu into his routine. The movements flow like a dance, each technique charged with meaning and story. Steve feels the discipline and control that Kung Fu demands, but there are still times when anger threatens to surface. In one particularly intense session, Steve attacks with a ferocity that surprises him. Daniel blocks the blows with ease, his expression serious. "Steve, stop now," orders Daniel, holding Steve's fist in the air. "You are letting anger control you again. That's not what I taught. If you don't learn to master this anger, it will overpower you." Steve recoils, feeling Daniel's disapproval deeply. He knows his mentor is right. Anger is a flame that, if left unchecked, can consume everything around it. He takes a deep breath, trying to find the calm that Daniel has always taught him to seek. "I get it," Steve says, his voice heavy. "I'll control it." Steve's anger, pent up during intense workouts with Daniel, reaches its boiling point on a silent night. Unable to control the emotional storm that consumes him, he decides to take to the streets of New York in the middle of the night, seeking relief for his growing frustration. The streets are deserted except for a few scattered figures. Steve walks quickly, fists clenched, thoughts blurred. He passes a group of drunk young men who laugh and talk loudly. Sensing the pungent smell of alcohol in the air, he tries to ignore them and move on, but a provocation makes him stop. "Hey, you there," shouts one of the young people, his voice dragged by alcohol. "You haven't showered since when? It looks like it came out of a sewer." The laughter of friends echoes down the street, each laugh a blow to Steve's pride. He tries to continue, but anger bubbles up inside him, demanding an escape valve. He turns around, eyes narrowed, and walks back in the direction of the young men. "What did you say?" he asks, his voice heavy with menace. Young people look at each other, laughing even more. "We're just kidding, man. No need to get mad." But it's too late. Steve's anger, fueled by years of injustice and pain, explodes. He attacks with a blind fury, delivering quick and precise blows. Young people, taken by surprise, try to defend themselves, but they are disoriented by alcohol. Steve's punches find their targets with painful precision, leaving the fallen youths bloodied and groaning on the ground. Adrenaline rushes through Steve's body, but at the sight of the bloodied and bruised young men, he feels a chill down his spine. The reality of his actions hits him hard. He recoils, his heart pounding wildly, and flees the scene, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets. Upon returning to the sewer, he is shaking, both from anger and fear. Daniel is awake, waiting for him with a serious expression. "Where have you been, Steve?" Daniel asks, his voice low but charged with concern. Steve does not respond immediately, trying to calm his breath and sort out his thoughts. He finally finds his voice, but it comes out shaky and guilt-ridden. I left." Daniel sighs deeply, running his hand over his face. He looks at Steve and sees his shirt with drops of blood, seeing not only the young man full of potential, but also the boy still trapped in an internal battle against his demons. "Steve, I understand your anger. I know she comes from a place of deep pain, but you can't let her control your actions. Beating up those young men doesn't solve anything. It only creates more pain, for them and for you." Steve feels Daniel's words sink in. He knows his mentor is right, but the guilt and shame are overwhelming. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I really feel it." Daniel walks over and puts a comforting hand on Steve's shoulder. "Feeling remorse is a start, Steve, but you need to learn to channel your anger in a constructive way. Let's work on this together. But for now, rest. Tomorrow will be a new day, and you will have another chance to do things right." Steve settles down, exhausted both physically and emotionally. He lies down, the weight of regret still present, but with a new determination to find a better way to deal with his anger. Daniel watches him with a certain fear that he is not doing the right thing. The months pass at a relentless pace, with Steve and Daniel immersed in training that pushes them to the edge of exhaustion. Mornings begin before the sun rises, and the days unfold in a series of intense workouts, hand-to-hand combat, and meditation sessions. Steve, now stronger and more disciplined, begins to question the greater purpose of his newly acquired abilities. On a particularly exhausting day, after a long training session, Steve and Daniel are sitting, catching their breath. Sweat drips down Steve's face, mixing with the dust on the floor of the underground headquarters. He looks at Daniel, his mind swarming with questions he can no longer contain. "Daniel, what should I do with all this?" asks Steve, his gaze fixed on the mentor. "With all this strength, all this skill, how can I use them to fight the injustices I see out there?" Daniel, visibly tired but with a gleam of wisdom in his eyes, takes a deep breath before answering. "Steve, you can't fight all the injustices in the world," he says calmly. "No one can." Steve frowns. Daniel's answer seems incomplete to him. He leans forward, insistent. "But why not?" he asks, frustration evident in his voice. "If I have the strength and ability, why can't I fight against all injustices?" Daniel watches Steve for a moment, choosing his words carefully. He knows that this is a crucial moment for the young man, a moment of learning that goes beyond physical training. Because injustice is vast and complex, Steve. If you try to fight all injustices, you will eventually lose yourself in the process. Anger and frustration will consume you, and you will lose what is most important, your humanity. Steve looks down, processing Daniel's words. He feels a heaviness in his heart, a growing understanding of the depth of what is being said. "Then what should I do?" he asks, his voice softer now. "How can I make a difference?" Daniel smiles slightly, seeing the change in Steve's attitude. He places a hand on the boy's shoulder, offering comfort and guidance. "Start with what you can achieve, Steve. Help those around you. Use your strength and skills to protect, not to attack. Fight injustice where you are, in your immediate circle, and inspire others to do the same. Small changes can add up to something big." "I understand, Daniel," he says finally. "I'll do what I can where I am." Daniel nods, satisfied with Steve's answer. He knows that the boy still has a lot to learn, but he sees in his eyes the flame of determination and the will to do good. "And remember, Steve, you are never alone in this fight. We're in this together, and together, we can make a difference." With this new perspective, Steve feels an inner peace he hasn't experienced before. He still carries the anger and pain of the past, but now he has a clear path ahead. A path where he can use his strength and abilities to do good, to create positive change, one person at a time. It was a silent night, the New York sky obscured by thick clouds that hid the stars. Steve, after another grueling day of training with Daniel, decided to walk the streets, seeking clarity and reflecting on his recent lessons. He learned to control his anger, to channel his strength for good. But that night, he would find himself in a situation that would test everything he had learned. While walking along the narrow alleys, Steve heard a muffled scream. His heart raced, and without hesitation, he ran in the direction of the sound. Around a corner, he saw a group of young men surrounding a girl who was clearly terrified. They laughed and mocked her, their dark intentions clear in their menacing attitudes. Steve didn't have to think twice. He approached quickly, fists clenched and anger controlled. ready to be channeled in defense of that innocent girl. "Leave her alone," shouted Steve, his voice resounding authoritatively down the alley. The young men turned, surprised at the interruption. One of them laughed, stepping forward. "And who will make us, you?" sneered, approaching Steve with an arrogant smile. Steve did not respond with words. Instead, he let his fists speak for him. With a quick and precise movement, he delivered a blow that hit the attacker in the chin, causing him to fall to the ground. The others, seeing the determination in Steve's eyes, hesitated for a moment before moving forward. Steve's training with Daniel now showed his worth. He moved with the agility and strength he had developed over the months, each stroke calculated to disarm and incapacitate without excessive violence. Within minutes, the attackers were on the ground, moaning in pain, unable to continue the threat. Steve turned to the girl, who was leaning against the wall, still shaking with fear. He held out his hand to her, his gaze gentle and comforting. "It's all right now. You're safe," he said, helping her up. The girl, with tears in her eyes, clung to him for a moment, sobbing with relief. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up," she said, her voice trembling. Steve nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. He had made a difference that night, used his strength to protect rather than destroy. "Just be careful. New York can be dangerous at night. Do you have someone who can pick you up?" he asked. The girl nodded, still recovering from the shock. "Yeah, I'm calling a friend. Thanks again." Steve waited until she was safe and out of danger before returning to the sewer. Adrenaline was still pumping in his veins when he reached the tunnels where Daniel was waiting for him. As soon as Steve reached the sewer, still with adrenaline coursing through his veins after the confrontation in the alley, he found Daniel waiting for him. Daniel, always attentive, immediately realized that something significant had occurred. He saw the determination in Steve's eyes, but he also noticed a new restlessness. "Steve, what happened out there?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but charged with concern. Steve took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. He still felt the excitement of having saved the girl, but also a growing confusion about what it meant to him. I saved a girl tonight. She was being attacked by a group of young men. I pushed them away. I used everything you taught me. I did the right thing, Daniel. I want to do more of that. I want to be a hero in the shadows, protecting the innocent." Daniel frowned, feeling a mixture of pride and concern. He knew Steve's desire to do good was sincere, but he also saw danger in the boy's idealized view of himself. "Steve, it's admirable that you want to help people, but we need to talk about the reality of what that means. You are not a comic book superhero. You are human, with limitations and vulnerabilities." Steve, still seething with energy, felt frustrated by Daniel's response. "But I have the skills, Daniel. I can make a difference. I can save lives." Daniel sighed, running his hand over his face. He needed to find a way to make Steve understand the complexity of the situation without dampening his enthusiasm. "I know you can make a difference, Steve, but we need to be realistic. Acting alone, like a vigilante, is dangerous. Not only for you, but for those around you. You can't just go around seeking confrontation. We need to be strategic, careful. The real world doesn't work like it does in comics." Steve folded his arms, trying to contain his frustration. "Then what should I do, Daniel? Staying down here while people out there need help?" Daniel approached Steve, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "I'm not saying that you should sit still. I am saying that we need a plan, an approach that takes into account our safety and the effectiveness of our actions. We're not invincible. We need to be smart, work cautiously and purposefully." Steve looked at Daniel, seeing the wisdom and concern in his eyes, but impatience still burned within him. "So how do we get started? How can we make a difference without putting ourselves at unnecessary risk?" Daniel smiled slightly, pleased to see that Steve was willing to listen and learn. "We started small, Steve. We help where we can, we build alliances, we understand the terrain. And above all, we never act on impulse." Daniel gave Steve a comforting pat on the shoulder, a gesture that conveyed both support and confidence. "Come on, Steve." Steve's training with Daniel has entered a new intense and challenging phase. After weeks of physical and mental discipline, It was time to explore the use of melee weapons. Steve, though young, absorbed each technique with youthful enthusiasm mixed with a renewed determination. In the vast space of the underground headquarters, Daniel made available a variety of weapons: nunchucks, batons, knives, and other tools that could be crucial in combat situations. Steve held a pair of nunchucks with a mixture of fascination and respect. He twirled them with clumsy movements at first, but soon began to master the basic movements under Daniel's careful guidance. Steve, the use of melee weapons requires not only physical skill, but also discernment and responsibility, Daniel explained as he watched Steve practice. They are powerful tools that should be used carefully and only when necessary. Steve nodded earnestly, absorbing every word of his mentor. He struggled to balance his youthful excitement with an understanding of the responsibility that came with coaching. As the days went by, Steve progressed rapidly. He learned defense and attack techniques with sticks, practiced precise cuts with knives, and explored the strategic possibilities of nunchucks. Each training session was an opportunity for him to develop not only his physical abilities, but also his mental discipline and emotional control. During one particularly intense session with knives, Steve felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. He imagined combat scenarios, thought about how he could use his new abilities to protect the innocent and take on opponents. "Steve, don't let enthusiasm cloud your judgment," Daniel recalled, noticing the intensity in his student's eyes. "Weapons are a last defense measure. Our goal is to avoid conflicts whenever possible." Steve took a deep breath, remembering Daniel's wise words. He knew that the true test of his abilities lay not only in his ability to wield weapons, but in his ability to discern when and how to use them ethically and effectively. Over time, Steve and Daniel continued to refine combat techniques and strengthen the bond between mentor and student. The young apprentice absorbed not only physical skills, but also profound lessons about responsibility, compassion, and justice. At the end of each day of training, Steve felt exhausted, but also refreshed. He knew he was becoming not just a skilled fighter, but someone who could make a difference in the world, the right way and with the values Daniel had taught him. And so, under Daniel's watchful guidance, Steve continued to prepare for the challenges that awaited him, knowing that his new abilities would be used not only for his own defense, but to protect those who could not protect themselves. Steve and Daniel were on one of their night patrols in New York, alert for any sign of danger. The intense training and the various previous missions had honed their skills and strengthened their bond. They moved with the precision of a well-trained team, ready to intervene where necessary. That night, they heard a cry for help coming from a side street. They run to the source of the sound and find a man mugging a woman. With quick, coordinated movements, Daniel and Steve immobilized the assailant, ensuring that the woman was safe. But then, something changed in Steve. The anger he had learned to control began to bubble up inside him. With the assailant already pinned to the ground, Steve began delivering violent kicks, his face contorted into an expression of pent-up fury. "Steve, stop!" Daniel shouted, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him back. "That's enough. He's surrendered." Steve reluctantly pulled away, still breathing heavily, his eyes fixed on the mugger who was moaning in pain on the ground. "He'll keep mugging if we free him, Daniel. These guys never change," shouted Steve, his voice full of frustration and anger. Daniel stepped closer, placing a firm hand on Steve's shoulder, his eyes filled with a controlled calm. "And what do you propose, Steve? That we become judges and executioners? Let's decide who deserves a second chance and who doesn't?" Steve looked at Daniel, his anger turning into a mixture of confusion and despair. "Me. I just want justice to be done. I want to protect people," Daniel sighed, letting go of Steve's shoulder and turning to the now unconscious assailant. "Justice is not revenge, Steve. Justice is doing what is right, even when it is difficult. Are you forgetting who you were? What if I had decided you didn't deserve a second chance?" Steve was silent, Daniel's words penetrating deep. He knew his mentor was right. He had also been a lost boy who needed guidance and compassion to change. "Me. I just don't want any more people to suffer like I did," Steve said, his voice now a whisper. Daniel nodded, understanding the pain and fear behind Steve's words. "And that's why we're here, Steve. To help, to protect, and to give people a chance to redeem themselves. But we can't do that if we let anger and frustration control us. We need to be better. We need to be fair. Steve took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. I'll try to be better. Daniel smiled slightly. Now come home. I'll take it from here. But master, let me help you. Now. And then the boy reluctantly returned home, feeling a little unworthy. As the months passed, Steve devoted himself more and more to training and missions. His talent was undeniable. He mastered complex combat techniques, accurately handled weapons, and demonstrated impressive agility. Daniel saw in Steve the potential to become a skilled and righteous warrior. However, he also noticed something darker growing inside the boy. The anger Steve was trying to control still burned within him, a flame that never completely went out. It was a force that drove him, but also one that threatened to consume him. One night, during a meditation and yoga session, Daniel decided to confront Steve about this anger. Steve, you are progressing rapidly, more than any other I have ever trained. But there's something we need to discuss, Daniel said, his voice calm and controlled. Steve opened his eyes, coming out of his meditation position, and looked at Daniel curiously. What is it, Daniel? Your anger, Steve. I see how she drives you, but I also see how she controls you sometimes. We need to deal with it before it consumes you. Steve sighed, looking away. He knew Daniel was right. Anger was a constant part of his life, something he carried with him from the days of orphanage and the streets. Anger is what keeps me moving, what gives me the strength to fight. Daniel nodded, understanding the depth of Steve's inner conflict. Anger can be a powerful force, but if left unchecked, it can destroy you. We need to find a way to channel it productively. We need to turn this anger into something positive, into determination and purpose. Steve took a deep breath, trying to process his mentor's words. But how, Daniel? How can I control something that seems so uncontrollable? Daniel smiled slightly, seeing Steve's willingness to face his inner demons. Let's start by identifying the causes of your anger. Let's work on ways to cope with these feelings without letting them overwhelm you. Meditation and yoga are just the beginning. We will explore techniques of self-control, visualization, and, above all, self-compassion. Over the next few days, Daniel intensified Steve's emotional control workouts. They spent hours in meditation, visualizing situations that aroused anger and practicing controlled responses. Daniel taught breathing techniques and ways to channel anger into concentrated strength without losing control. Despite the progress, there were times when Steve's anger overflowed. During a hand-to-hand combat training, he lost control and attacked with an inordinate fury. Daniel stopped him, holding him tightly by the shoulders. "Get a grip, Steve. Remember what we learned," shouted Daniel, trying to bring Steve back to reality. Steve stopped, panting, his face red with anger and frustration. He looked at Daniel, seeing the concern in his mentor's eyes. I'm sorry, Daniel. I know, Steve. But it is at such moments that you need to remember what you are learning. Anger can be your ally, but only if you master it, and not vice versa. Steve nodded, taking a deep breath, trying to regain control. I'll try, Daniel. I will try. One night, while patrolling the streets of New York, Steve heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of gunfire, followed by the scream of a victim. He ran in the direction of the sound and saw a man shooting at another person, who fell to the ground, motionless, bathed in blood. The gunman quickly stole the victim's belongings and fled. Steve, driven by adrenaline and a sense of justice, decided to follow the shooter. He kept himself in the shadows, moving nimbly and carefully so as not to be detected. The man ran through the streets, looking back occasionally, but not realizing that he was being followed. Steve followed him until he entered an old, dimly lit house. Steve watched the house and the man for a few minutes, memorizing every detail of the place and that subject before returning to the sewer. When he finally returned to the underground headquarters, it was almost morning. He was exhausted, but the image of the crime continued to haunt him, leaving him distressed and distraught. He found Daniel sitting down, reviewing some documents. Steve walked over and sat down, still trying to process what he had witnessed. "Daniel, I need to talk to you," Steve said. his voice heavy with emotion. Daniel raised his eyes and noticed the seriousness on Steve's face. "What happened, Steve?" Daniel asked, putting the documents aside. Steve told Daniel about what he had seen that night. The man shooting, stealing, and running away. He described how he followed him into the house and how he couldn't stop thinking about the victim and the attacker's impunity. "How can we talk about justice when things like this happen, Daniel? How can I continue to know that there are people out there who commit these horrible crimes and seem to get away with it?" Steve asked, his voice heavy with frustration and sadness. Daniel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Steve's words. He knew this was a pivotal moment for the young man, a moment that could define his understanding of justice and his role as protector. "Steve, justice is not an easy road. It is complex, full of challenges, and often frustrating. What you have seen is horrible, and it is natural to feel distressed and angry. But it is at such moments that we need to remember why we do what we do," said Daniel calmly. "But how can I live with it? How can I accept that there are bad people out there, and we can't stop them all?" Steve asked, his voice almost a whisper. "We can't stop them all, Steve. We cannot be everywhere at the same time. But this does not mean that our actions are in vain. Every person we help, every life we protect, makes a difference. Justice is not about eradicating all evil in the world, but about fighting for what is right, even when it is difficult." Steve looked at Daniel, absorbing his words. "So what do we do now?" Steve asked, his voice full of determination despite the pain he felt. "We're still fighting. We continue to do our part. And when we encounter injustices, we act with intelligence and compassion. And we never forget that even on the worst nights, we're still making a difference." A few nights after the crime that had left him so distraught, Steve came across that man again. He stood on a busy street, laughing and having fun, as if the atrocity he had committed did not weigh on his conscience. The sight made Steve's blood boil. Driven by intense and uncontrollable anger, Steve decided to follow the man. He discreetly followed him through the streets, keeping in the shadows so as not to be seen. The man, oblivious to Steve's presence, continued his evening, drunk, laughing and fussing with others, as if he had not a single concern in the world. As the night wore on, Steve saw the man heading to the same house where he had seen him enter the night of the crime. Steve's anger grew with every step. When the man finally entered his home, Steve waited a few minutes, adrenaline coursing through his veins, before quietly approaching. Steve entered the house through the back door, moving with the dexterity he had learned from Daniel. The man was upstairs, unaware of Steve's presence. Every step Steve took was charged with a growing fury, an anger he struggled to control from the moment he decided to follow the man. Upon arriving upstairs, Steve found the man sitting in an armchair, still laughing at something on his phone. The vision ended the control Steve was trying to maintain. He moved forward quickly, catching the man by surprise. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" shouted the man, trying to get up looking for his weapon. But Steve didn't answer. Anger overwhelmed him completely, and he lashed out with a violence he had never experienced. Blow after blow, he took out all his frustration and pain, his mind clouded by the desire for revenge. When it finally stopped, the man was motionless on the blood-soaked floor, his lifeless body evidence of Steve's uncontrolled rage. The sight of what he had done began to penetrate his consciousness, and a feeling of horror and regret hit him hard. Steve stepped back, looking at his bloody hands and the body in front of him. He felt the weight of his actions, the shock of what had become. The image of the now disfigured man who had killed in cold blood with his own fists haunted his mind. He fled the house, moving through the streets of New York like a ghost, disoriented and consumed by the horror of what he had done. The way back to the sewer was a fog of confusion and fear. When he finally arrived at headquarters, it was almost morning. Daniel was there, waiting for him. The expression on his face changed from concern to alarm upon seeing Steve's condition. "Steve, what happened?" asked Daniel, quickly approaching. Steve, still in shock, tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Finally, he managed to babble. "Me. I killed him, Daniel. I killed that man." Daniel stood motionless, Steve's words hitting him like a blow. He knew that Steve was fighting his anger, but he had never imagined that it would take him to such an extreme. "Steve," Daniel began, trying to find the right words. Steve didn't wait to hear. He fell to his knees, his mind a storm of regret and horror. "What have I done, Daniel? What have I become?" Steve asked, his voice broken by despair. Daniel knelt next to Steve, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the weight of the moment. "I killed him, Daniel. That man who shot the victim. I followed him and killed him," Steve replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Daniel stepped forward, his face grim. "Why, Steve? Why did you do that?" Steve felt the anger grow again, like an uncontrollable flame. "Because he was rubbish, Daniel. He didn't deserve to live. He took the life of an innocent person and continued to live as if nothing had happened. Why can't I use my power to sweep away evil?" shouted Steve, his voice echoing through the sewer. Daniel shook his head, pain visible in his eyes. "Steve, you're out of control. That is not the way of justice. We are not judges, juries, and executioners. What you did was murder, not justice." Steve felt anger and frustration boil over. "And what do you expect me to do? Stand still while monsters like him walk free? If I have the power, why can't I use it to clean the streets?" Daniel took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Because using power like that only makes you worse, Steve. Anger and violence are not the answer. We fight for justice, but within the limits of morality and law. What you did doesn't make you better than him." Steve looked at Daniel, fury giving way to despair. "So what am I now, Daniel? A killer?" Daniel put his hands on Steve's shoulders, forcing him to look into his eyes. "You are someone who made a serious mistake, but you still have a chance to change, to do things differently." Steve swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Daniel's words. Anger and frustration still seethed within him, but there was something else, a firm determination. "I don't want to do things differently, Daniel. I want to do things my way. I don't want to be someone who expects bad things to happen. I want to intervene. I want to act before more innocents are hurt," Steve said, his voice shaking with emotion. Daniel looked at him for a long moment, a deep sadness in his eyes. He knew Steve was on edge, and the choice he made now could define his future in irreversible ways. "Steve, if this is the path you choose, then you can no longer stay here. I cannot support someone who acts outside the bounds of morality and justice that we teach. But know that each path leads to a different destination, and you need to be prepared for the path you have chosen," Daniel said, his voice firm but full of regret. Steve felt a pang of pain as he heard those words. He respected Daniel, saw in him a mentor and a father figure, but anger and the desire to act in his own way were stronger. "So that's it, Daniel? Are you kicking me out?" asked Steve, trying to hide the pain in his voice. "I'm not kicking you out, Steve. I am telling you that if you choose this path, it cannot be walked here. Here, we follow a code, a moral. If you cannot accept this, then you need to find your own way," answered Daniel calmly. Steve looked around the sewer, the place that had become his home, where he had learned so much. He felt a lump in his throat, but the determination in his heart was clear. "I understand, Daniel. I need to do it my way. Thank you for everything you've done for me, but I can't follow your rules anymore," Steve said, turning to leave. Daniel watched Steve leave, feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. He knew that Steve was walking a dangerous path, but he also knew that the boy needed to make his own choices and learn from them. "Good luck, Steve. May you find what you are looking for, and may you not get lost on the way," Daniel said softly, more to himself than to Steve. Steve came out of the sewer, feeling a mixture of freedom and uncertainty. He didn't know exactly what the future held for him, but he knew he was determined to go his own way, to fight evil the way he believed was right. Steve, now on his own, began patrolling the streets of New York City at night. Without Daniel's guidance, he followed his own instincts, acting with fierce determination. His fighting skills, honed by intense training, made him a ruthless force. The nights were his ally. He moved in the shadows, watching the darkest corners of the city, looking for those who caused pain and suffering to the innocent. And when he met them, the accumulated anger turned into a storm of uncontrolled violence. The bandits began to feel Steve's presence even before they saw him. It was a subtle but growing terror, Rumors circulated among the criminals. A young man who appeared from the shadows, distributing justice with his fists. Some called him the Avenger of the Dawn. Others whispered stories about his superhuman abilities as a night demon. One night, Steve encountered a group of abusers in an alley, cornering an elderly woman. The attackers laughed, sure of their impunity. But then, a figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes shining with growing anger. Without hesitation, Steve moved forward. His movements were precise and efficient. He disarmed the first assailant with a quick blow, knocking him down with a kick to the knee. The second tried to react, but Steve dodged the punch and knocked him down with a hook to the chin. The third ran, but did not go far. Steve caught up with him and pinned him with a blow to the back of the head. The lady looked at Steve with gratitude and fear. Steve just nodded, indicating that she should leave. The woman fled, leaving Steve with the thugs on the ground. The anger still burned in his chest, and he finished hurting them. He couldn't leave them whole to continue that practice. These actions were repeated night after night. Steve was a ghost to the bad guys, a savior to the innocent. His reputation grew, and with it, fear among criminals. The streets began to talk about the young Avenger, and even the police heard rumors about the mysterious crime fighter. However, with this notoriety came new challenges. Sooner or later, Steve knew that his violent approach would draw unwanted attention. But for now, he continued, determined to do justice in his own way, to clean up the streets of New York. Months after going his own way, Steve patrolled the streets of New York City on a cold dawn. His name was now known and feared among criminals. As he quietly moved through the alleys, he saw a familiar figure. Daniel was there, apparently waiting for him. Steve approached, his heart racing at the sight of his old mentor. "What are you doing here?" Steve asked, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and respect. Daniel smiled slightly, his tired eyes reflecting the dim light of the streets. "I hear things have been going well for you," Daniel replied, his voice calm. Steve nodded, feeling a hint of pride. "Yeah, I've been keeping the streets safer. The city is beginning to change." He hesitated, then added, "Thanks to what you taught me." Daniel kept smiling, but there was a seriousness in his gaze. "I'm glad to hear that, Steve, but be careful." Steve frowned, a sense of unease rising in his chest. "Careful? Why? What do you know that I don't know?" Daniel took a deep breath, looking straight into Steve's eyes. "I'm just telling you to be cautious. Barely. Be careful, Steve." Steve felt the frustration grow. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand what Daniel was trying to tell him. "Daniel, what do you know? Why are you warning me now?" Steve insisted, his voice revealing the tension. Daniel did not answer directly. He just put a hand on Steve's shoulder, the look serious. "Good luck, Steve. Take care." And with these words, he turned around and disappeared into the shadows of the city. Steve stood there, confused and uneasy. Daniel's warning resonated in his mind, increasing his anxiety. But he knew that whatever danger was approaching, he would face it head-on. Determined to continue his mission, Steve took a deep breath and returned to the shadows, ready for another night of crime fighting. Sometime after Daniel's warning, Steve continued his night patrol, keeping the streets of New York safe in his own way. That night, everything seemed normal, until he heard a suspicious sound coming from a dark alley. With heightened senses, he approached, prepared to intervene in yet another crime. Around the corner, he saw a hooded man apparently trying to break down the door of a warehouse. Steve quickly moved forward, believing he was facing another assault. With a quick movement, he immobilized the man, throwing him against the wall. "You thought you could steal with impunity?" Steve growled, ready to deliver another criminal to justice. But then he realized something was wrong. From the dark corners of the alley, other men emerged, surrounding him. They were waiting for him. "We got you, Avenger of the early mornings," one of the men said, his voice full of malice. Steve prepared to fight. He knew he was at a disadvantage, but his determination was unwavering. He attacked the first one who approached, delivering a well-aimed blow that knocked him down. He then turned to face the others, moving with the speed and precision that Daniel had taught him. Despite his ability, the numbers were against him. Steve wounded some of the attackers, but they kept coming. Blows hit him from all sides, and he began to feel exhaustion take hold of his body. Finally, a hard blow to the head made him stagger, and he fell to his knees. Before he could get up, he was brutally knocked down and beaten. Men beat him mercilessly, each punch and kick a cruel reminder of his vulnerability. Steve struggled to maintain consciousness, his body a sea of pain. At that moment, sirens cut off the night air. The attackers quickly dispersed, disappearing into the shadows as police arrived. Officers rushed to the alley, finding Steve sprawled on the ground, covered in blood and injuries. "We got a wounded man here," one of the policemen shouted, calling for help. Steve, panting and aching, felt firm hands lift him up. The officers handcuffed him, barely realizing that he was the victim and not the aggressor. Confused and exhausted, he had no strength to protest. "You are under arrest," said one of the policemen, not understanding the complexity of the situation. As he was led into the car, Steve stared at the flashing lights, a sense of despair and failure gripping him. He had fallen into the ambush and was now in the hands of the law. Daniel's warning echoed in his mind, and he wondered what the future held for him. Steve was led away by police, his hands handcuffed and body aching after the ambush. At the police station, they tried to identify who he was, but his clandestine activities and lack of identity made the process difficult. However, they found some minor offenses committed by him when he was younger. Due to this, he was detained and sent to a medium security prison, where criminals of varying degrees of dangerousness were incarcerated. Inside the prison, Steve felt displaced and vulnerable. He was used to being the hunter, not the prey. The days dragged on slowly, and he tried to keep himself out of trouble by concentrating on recovering from his injuries. But news of his capture spread quickly. Rumors about the Avenger of the early mornings had even seeped into the walls of the prison. Some inmates, especially those who had crossed his path in the streets, recognized him. Menacing glances followed him on all sides. One night, while Steve was on the patio, trying to keep a low profile, a group of men approached. He recognized them from their patrol nights. "Look who we have here," one of them said, a cruel smile on his face. The hero of the early mornings. Steve remained calm, but he sensed the impending danger. He knew there would be no easy escape this time. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice strained. "Justice, revenge, call it what you want." The leader of the group laughed, moving closer. Before Steve could react, the men attacked him. He fought with all his might, but his wounds were not yet fully healed, and the numbers were against him. Blows and kicks hit him from all sides. He felt the sharp pain of a blade piercing his body. As he fell to the ground, bloodied and exhausted, his mind went back to the days of training with Daniel, the streets of New York, and the innocence he tried to protect. Months before starting his training with Daniel, Steve was still a young man lost on the streets of New York, surviving from petty thefts and robberies. That night, he had managed to steal a cell phone from an unsuspecting man. Feeling victorious, he ran through the alleys, ignoring the world around him. Around a corner, he bumped into someone. The impact was strong enough to almost knock him over. Looking up, he saw an older man with a piercing gaze and firm posture. It was Daniel. "Where do you think you're going with this?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but charged with authority. Steve, still nervous from the adrenaline rush of the robbery, tried to run away, but Daniel stretched out his arm, blocking his way. "Get out of my way, old man," growled Steve, trying to look more threatening than he really felt. When Daniel did not move, Steve, desperate, attacked. He threw a punch toward Daniel's face, but the man moved with surprising agility, deflecting with ease. Steve tried again, but every move was deflected with almost casual precision. "That's too easy, kid," Daniel said, a slight smile on his lips. Cowed and frightened, Steve finally gave up. He fell to his knees, panting and defeated. He looked at the cell phone in his hand, the last reminder of his small victory, and placed it at Daniel's feet. "Me, I don't want that anymore. Here." Steve's voice trembled, a mixture of fear and frustration. Daniel looked at his cell phone, but didn't pick it up. Instead, he ducked down, standing facing Steve. "I don't want that, kid. I want you to give it back," he said, his voice firm but gentle. Steve, confused and frightened, got up quickly and ran. Daniel's image lingered behind him as he walked away, his heart pounding. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, he looked at the cell phone in his hand. The idea of returning the object seemed ridiculous. With one last look toward the alley where he had found Daniel, Steve put the cell phone in his pocket and decided to sell it soon after. Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.